Hello, I'm going to read out one of my stories now called St. Mary's. Um, for you, if is an audience, I don't know whether I'm set up everywhere I try and find an outlet for being able to communicate with someone, knowing that to an extent, as an older person, maybe not a wiser person, hopefully as an older person, and also to some extent, not a wiser, but a person with some wisdom, um, I do feel as though a measure of being able to teach, um, not necessarily prescribed subjects, but enable, and hopefully I won't be despised for trying to communicate some of the things that have happened or that I imagine may have happened to some people over the time that I've been alive, in the hope that it may help or instruct or guide people going forward. Now, this is a very sad story in some ways. This poor girl has decided, and this was back in the 1980s, and it's not left clear whether she changed her mind, but she decided that she may not want children. I don't think that she was necessarily thinking that she would have to necessarily become a nun, even in those times, because she'd made that decision or thought she may have made that decision. So it's called St. Mary's. Sharon Smith Burnley early on decided that she may not be the type to go ahead and bear children. It was not because she was in any apparent or even secret way more attracted to girls than to boys, but because she had become more and more anxious as she developed into her teenage years about the worry of exposing an innocent child to what she was beginning to regard as a totally sick society and culture. The daily round of the Sun newspaper in those days, back in the mid-80s, displaying page 3 girls as though they were objects set up to be pulled apart by criticism or despised by a woman for sending her working husband into a state of lust. The array of seedy magazines above head height in every garage or newsagents. The talked-of prevalence of child abusers, and the ever-present threat that a nuclear bomb might obliterate everyone and take most of nature with it, had early on sent her into a defensive, depressed, and cynical corner, which she wanted the power to decorate with as many ornaments and niche occupations and objects as she could. Before that line of thinking had taken hold, she had been both an obedient and optimistic girl, and had automatically respected her elders to such an extent that she failed to subject them to any form of analysis whatsoever. In fact, she purposely came to avoid analysing. She admired all her teachers. One day, she opened a drawer in her dad's study desk to find out that she'd been sent off to a girls' middle boarding school because her father had expected wife swapping from her mother with his friends. She had been home for the holidays and looking for a stamp, and had dared into his desk so that she could send a letter off to a French pen friend, when she found the letter from her uncle underneath a gold leaf patterned box of cigars in the drawer, and had read that he was definitely colluding with what he spelled out in the letter was his brother-in-law's choice of lifestyle, and that it was even offering to film it all on his own cine camera. She had not known whether she ought to feel as though her mother needed defending, or whether she too was complicit somehow. Sharon had watched her fiddling about making spaghetti bolognese and encouraging smoked cheese sausages with a hostility from that point. She wondered just how many guests her mother was catering for on the pretext of talking about the golf club whilst she was at St. Mary's. It made Sharon feel as though all her studies were somehow spoof, that the chapel every morning was an attempt to erase the guilty from any line of criticism, and indeed that the school had hid the girls away into a rather eclectic enclave, purposely choosing to teach them watercolour painting and to wrap them up in the mythology of the classics, and keep them occupied with not being able to get a grip on the gerund tense, which would have left them feeling as though there may be some definite fear behind the choice to obey the mandatory. In many ways, she appreciated her schooling more than she had done previous to that. When she'd been in her 40s, she had taken on her uncle about that letter, and he had made out that she'd been mistaken and that it had all been humorous. Other girls at the school had fallen into liking ABBA, but she liked the lonely, mysterious tones of her clarinet, able to keep curious without the pain of discovery, partly blaming the ABBA culture rave for her parents' demise and eventual divorce. It had been uncomfortably obvious from the ABBA film that they too were trying to make out that wife swapping may be cool. Some of her companions had been through similar shocks. She remembered Edwina confessing tearfully and very miserably that her own mother had been a bunny girl once at a Playboy mansion. They had both witnessed BBC TV programmes which suggested that the office type of man was a foil to excuse a briefcase stuffed with CD magazines and to get long-nailed secretaries onto the scene. The boxing on the TV, the assumption that every girl would find a large car drop dead irresistible, the violence on the news, it was all, in her own estimation, absolutely rifely awful. Sharon estimated highly her school's attempts not only to protect the pupils from it all, but to encourage them into a state where they were refusing, as vehemently as they could, to recognise the cynicism of the cultural environment and to surround themselves with an aura of wise learning, partly on purpose, to keep them in a haze of likeably dim ignorance. The dream world was definitely preferable. The older she became, the more Sharon realised that the male culture was trying to circumscribe and besmirch female value systems at every turn. Just because she liked crafts, there were accusations coming at her that she must somehow be a witch-like entity, whereas actually it made sense to hang on from being thrown into the main thrust of the traffic with greater and greater adherence the more clamour against the feminine increased. One of her teachers, Mrs. Bradley, had used to suggest that there, in fact, needed to be put in place a firm division between science and art subjects, and that science was run by males who wished to dominate and categorise everything almost out of any existence beyond their own egos and team groups. She had insisted on many occasions, keeping her eyes flickeringly shut as she spoke, as though to blank away an attempt to shock her, or make uneven her mood and temper. Also to those who later expressed skepticism of her lectures, wishing to be as modern as they could and to depose her by parent power from remaining a teacher there, that computers were to be feared as the enemy, and that science had become dominated itself a mathematical obsession, an obsession which would turn out to be faulty and misguided, and which would eventually threaten the humane itself. Surprisingly, the humane, however the financial situation was managed, was amongst most of them able to hold them and remain itself in reverence and respect. Though Sharon had heard of atrocities in foreign countries and starvation in Africa, the few black pupils at St. Mary's were all daughters of princes and chieftains. They kept quiet most of the time, never revealing by anything to do with their disposition that they might have witnessed misery or tribal dances in the night time. Nor did any of the other pupils ever question or ask what it was normally like for them in the country they travelled back to every summer. So, beyond what took place in the chapel, which might be worryingly farcical sometimes, there was a kind of religion to St. Mary's, to do partly with dainty cups clinking onto china saucers and sandwiches grazed with finely grated cucumber slices, which, though it might itself have been financed by corrupt and potentially unspeakable means, remained charmingly fairy tale-like and stolidly, purposefully, resolutely naive.